A pack a day would have been considered light work in old Hollywood. Some actors were burning through 120 cigarettes before the day was done. These weren't casual smokers. They were people who lived inside a self-created haze, hour after hour, year after year. On screen, they were kings, cowboys, and icons of a golden era. Off camera, their bodies were quietly being worn down by decades of damage they couldn't see coming. Here are 15 Hollywood legends, and the brutal truth of how that habit finally caught up with each of them. Number 15. Buster Keaton. Buster Keaton built his entire career on doing the impossible and walking away from it. Watch any of his silent films, and you'll see a man leaping off moving trains, surviving collapsing buildings, and absorbing punishment that would have broken almost anyone else. His body looked indestructible up there on screen, but what actually dismantled him had nothing to do with a stunt. Keaton was a notorious smoker for most of his adult life. People who worked alongside him recalled that a cigarette was practically attached to his hand, and some reports put his daily intake as high as 3 packs. Whether that number held every single day or not, the volume he was pulling through his lungs was relentless. It didn't matter what he was doing, running through a stunt, sitting in the editing room, sitting down for a meal, the cigarettes were always there, a constant background presence. The irony of how his health unraveled is hard to look past. His entire legacy rested on physical precision, split-second timing, and complete command of his own body. Yet he handed his internal health over to a daily chemical dependency without ever really walking away from it. By his late 60s, that famous agility was completely gone, replaced by the labored, heavy breathing of advanced lung cancer. His final weeks were spent in a hospital bed, slowly losing the ability to breathe. The man who made a living outrunning disaster on screen was quietly suffocated by the one habit he never quit. Number 14. Michael Landon. If you watched American television through the 70s and 80s, Michael Landon was the picture of strength and wholesomeness. Whether he was pushing through frontier life on Little House on the Prairie or showing up as an angel in Highway to Heaven, his on-screen presence radiated health, endurance, and clean-cut vitality. He wasn't just acting either. He was writing, directing, and essentially running full network productions at the same time. The man was a one-person operation. But behind that image of boundless energy, Landon had a long, heavy relationship with tobacco. He was widely known to chain smoke while working, using cigarettes to keep pace with the sheer demands of managing his television empire. Most people connect smoking to lung disease, but the carcinogens you breathe in don't stop there. They move through your bloodstream and reach every major organ in the body. In Landon's case, decades of heavy smoking drove up his risk for one of the most brutal and fast-moving diseases a person can face, pancreatic cancer. What makes his physical deterioration so hard to process is the speed of it. Landon wasn't an old man winding down at the end of a long life. He was in his early 50s, still sharp and active, when the disease hit. He told the public about his diagnosis in April of 1991, facing it with the same openness he'd brought to everything else, but the cancer didn't care about his attitude. It tore through his internal systems so quickly that there was never a real window for a prolonged medical battle. Less than 3 months after going public, his body gave out completely. He was 54 years old. It's a stark reminder of how a habit you maintain quietly over decades can bring down a body that looks perfectly healthy in a matter of weeks. Number 13. David Janssen. For 4 seasons on The Fugitive, millions of Americans watched David Janssen run. As Dr. Richard Kimball, his entire identity on screen was built around endurance, staying a step ahead, surviving on nothing, and pushing through exhaustion to avoid capture. Off camera, though, Janssen was quietly doing the opposite. He had a reputation inside the industry as a fierce smoker. Colleagues and various accounts from the period suggest he could burn through as many as 4 packs in a single day. Pair that with a notoriously heavy drinking habit, and the human cardiovascular system simply can't keep pace. Nicotine squeezes the arteries tight, forcing the heart to work harder and harder just to move blood through the body. What makes Janssen's story so telling is that the damage was visible to anyone watching. If you go back and look at his TV appearances in the late 1970s, you're not looking at a man in his mid-40s. His face was deeply creased, aged well beyond his years by the constant chemical pressure his habits were putting on his body. His voice, once smooth and commanding, the kind a leading man depends on, had worn down into a raspy, hollow gravel. The audience was essentially watching his respiratory and circulatory systems come apart in front of them. The body can only absorb so much punishment before something critical breaks. For Janssen, that break came far too soon. At just 48 years old, a point when most actors are hitting their creative stride, his heart finally gave out. He spent his career playing a man who could slip out of any trap life set for him, but he couldn't escape the slow damage his own daily choices had been stacking up for years. Number 12. John Cazale. There's a record in film history that almost certainly will never be matched. Cazale appeared in exactly 5 feature films before his death. Among them, The Godfather, The Conversation, and Dog Day Afternoon, and every single one received a nomination for the Academy Award for Best Picture. He was the kind of actor other actors studied. He could hold a scene together without raising his voice, without forcing a single moment. But the body doesn't make exceptions for talent, and off-camera, Cazale was a committed chain smoker. The same lungs that powered some of the most carefully measured performances of the entire 1970s were being steadily coated in tar and toxins, day after day. Lung cancer moves quickly when it's had years of heavy smoking to feed on. By the time Cazale was diagnosed in 1977, the disease had already taken serious hold. He was just 41 years old, standing at what should have been the entrance to a legendary career, and instead he was struggling to breathe. The decline came fast. He grew so physically weak during the production of his final film, The Deer Hunter, that the studio actively pushed to have him removed from the cast, worried his body wouldn't hold out until filming finished. He died in 1978 at 42. Cazale's story is a stark reminder of how a daily habit, as ordinary as lighting a cigarette, can quietly dismantle even the most extraordinary rise. His gift on screen was one of a kind. His vulnerability to tobacco was not. Number 11. Walt Disney. The name Walt Disney means something specific to most people. Childhood wonder, clean family stories, the idea that happy endings are real. He built an entire empire around that promise. But the man actually running that studio lived in considerable contradiction with his own brand. Behind the scenes, Disney was a notorious chain smoker who regularly preferred his cigarettes unfiltered. From a purely physical standpoint, that choice stripped away the only modest barrier between burning tobacco and his lungs. For decades, every cigarette he lit sent an unobstructed wave of tar, heat, and carcinogens straight into the lining of his respiratory system. People who worked alongside him said they could hear him coming down the hallway before they ever saw him, that chronic dry cough announcing his arrival. It was the sound of a body that had been under sustained respiratory stress for years. The collapse of his health happened with jarring speed. In late 1966, Disney checked himself into a hospital reporting neck and back pain, likely thinking it was an old polo injury flaring up again. What doctors found instead was a large, aggressive tumor that had taken over his left lung. The disease had been advancing in silence while he was busy drawing up the plans for Disney World and Epcot. Just over a month after that diagnosis, his body gave out entirely. He was 65 years old. There's a deeply unsettling twist in the fact that the man who built the happiest place on earth spent his final weeks suffocating slowly inside a hospital room, undone by a habit he'd carried every single day of his adult life. Number 10. Rod Serling. Most people picture him exactly the same way. A sharp suit, a black and white frame, a lit cigarette held between his fingers as he steps in to introduce the next journey into the Twilight Zone. On screen, that cigarette was part of the act, something that made him look cool, measured, and in control. Off-screen, it was quietly destroying him. Serling was a relentlessly driven writer and producer, and he managed that punishing creative output by leaning hard on nicotine. People who knew him well recalled that he could burn through 3 or 4 packs in a single day. Most people connect heavy smoking with lung disease, but Serling's body was taking damage somewhere else entirely. Nicotine hammers the heart rate and tightens the blood vessels continuously. When you hold your body in that state of forced stimulation from morning to midnight, day after day, the heart eventually breaks under the pressure. By his late 40s, his circulatory system was starting to fail. This wasn't a slow respiratory decline, it was sharp and cardiovascular. He suffered 2 heart attacks back to back, then had to survive a grueling 10-hour open-heart bypass surgery. But his body had nothing left to draw from. His heart couldn't take what the surgery put it through. He suffered a 3rd heart attack while still recovering in the hospital, and that one killed him. He was only 50 years old. The man who spent his career crafting stories about people caught in inescapable ironies ultimately wrote his own version of one. Number 9. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra was known to the world as the Voice. His phrasing, his breath control, his tone, all of it made him one of the most commanding entertainers the 20th century ever produced. He built an entire global legacy on his ability to shape sound through his vocal cords. And yet, for decades, he pulled hot, unfiltered smoke directly across that same instrument. The cigarette was woven into his Rat Pack identity, right alongside the tailored suit and the whiskey glass. From the outside, it all looked like effortless cool. Inside, his organs were absorbing a constant flood of toxins. People tend to think of smoking as a lung problem, but Sinatra's medical history tells a much more complete and sobering story. The carcinogens Sinatra inhaled didn't simply disappear. They entered his bloodstream and had to be processed out of his system. Years of heavy smoking contributed to severe respiratory problems, recurring bouts of pneumonia, chronic high blood pressure, and eventually bladder cancer, a disease closely tied to the body's effort to flush out the chemicals packed into every cigarette. By his late 70s, the man who had once seemed untouchable was grinding through an exhausting cycle of hospital stays. His cardiovascular and respiratory systems had taken decades of punishment and were simply worn down. The legendary breath control that once let him hold a note longer than anyone else in the room had been replaced by a daily fight just to pull in enough air. He died of a heart attack at 82. It was a long life, but his final years were defined by a body that had been quietly taken apart from the inside. The damage didn't announce itself all at once. It just kept compounding. Number 8. Julie London. London built a massive career on a very specific kind of sound. If you've ever listened to her iconic recording of Crimea River, you already know it's not a powerhouse voice. It's intimate, breathy, smoky, and almost effortlessly controlled. She used that sultry vocal quality to sell millions of records and pivot into a successful acting career. But the instrument producing that famous sound was absorbing punishment every single day. London started smoking as a teenager and carried a serious dependency throughout her entire adult life, with some accounts placing her habit at up to 3 packs a day. For decades, the very respiratory system she depended on to land those delicate, controlled notes was being continuously coated in tar and chemical irritants. That kind of prolonged exposure tends to collect its toll in stages. The first sign came in 1995, when she suffered a debilitating stroke that severely affected both her health and her mobility. 4 years after that, the cumulative damage to her lungs ended in a lung cancer diagnosis. There's a deeply uncomfortable irony in how her story closes. A woman whose entire artistic identity was built on effortless breath control spent her final years in a desperate, exhausting struggle just to breathe. She passed away in 2000, following a severe episode of respiratory distress. That's the harsh reality of heavy, long-term smoking. It doesn't just silence a singer's voice. It systematically cuts off the most fundamental thing a person can do. Number 7. Jack Webb. On the classic television series Dragnet, Webb played Sergeant Joe Friday, a detective built on cold logic, rigid discipline, and an absolute insistence on hard facts. He was the voice of reason in every scene. But when it came to his own body, Webb spent his entire life ignoring the physical evidence right in front of him. Clifton Webb came into the world, already fighting his own body. Asthma left his airways chronically inflamed, perpetually narrowed, and hypersensitive to anything in the air around him. Just breathing ordinary air on an ordinary day took real effort for him. And yet, against all medical logic, he smoked up to 3 packs of cigarettes daily. Pulling thick, hot smoke into lungs that were already struggling to function is about as damaging as it sounds. Those lungs couldn't extract enough oxygen to keep the blood properly supplied, so his heart had to compensate, pumping harder and faster just to keep his basic systems alive. Webb put his cardiovascular system through that same grinding emergency every single day for decades. The nicotine tightened his blood vessels, while his asthma-scarred lungs denied his heart the oxygen it needed to function at anything close to normal capacity. The heart is a tough muscle, but it has limits. At 62, Webb's body finally reached those limits, and he died of a fatal heart attack. He spent his career playing a man who read between the lines and exposed what others couldn't see. In his own life, he refused to read the writing on the wall. The addiction he never challenged ultimately killed him. Number 6 on our list is Humphrey Bogart, and this one needs almost no introduction. Bogart didn't just play the hard-boiled tough guy, he essentially defined what that character looks like on screen. Standing in the fog of Casablanca, or drifting through the moral shadows of the Maltese Falcon, that cigarette in the corner of his mouth wasn't just a prop. It was part of his identity, a signal to every audience that this was a man untouchable by weakness, fear, or pain. He wore invulnerability, like a second skin. But biology doesn't make exceptions for movie stars. Bogart combined decades of heavy, unfiltered cigarette smoking with a notoriously high intake of alcohol, and that combination is clinically brutal. Alcohol strips away the protective lining of the throat and esophagus, leaving the tissue raw and exposed, while tobacco smoke delivers the concentrated carcinogens that go straight to work on those unprotected cells. The result was esophageal cancer, and it's one of the most punishing diseases a person can face. What made his decline especially cruel was how precisely the illness targeted him. Esophageal cancer attacks the body's ability to swallow, to take in food, to sustain itself through the most basic of human functions. The man who projected absolute physical command on screen was quietly wasting away at home, unable to eat, losing weight at a rate that stripped away everything that had made him look so formidable. Surgery to remove the cancerous tissue came too late. His body was already too depleted to recover. He was 57 years old when he died. Bogart spent his entire career building the image of a man who could outthink and outlast anyone who came at him. But a daily habit was quietly eating away at his throat the whole time. Number 5. Barbara Stanwyck. Most people who end up smoking for life light their first cigarette somewhere in their late teens or early 20s. Stanwyck picked hers up at 9 years old. By the time she was cementing herself as one of the sharpest, most independent women in Hollywood, carrying films like Double Indemnity and commanding the screen in the Big Valley, her lungs had already absorbed decades of serious chemical punishment. She spent her career playing women who answered to no one, yet she spent almost all of her life quietly bound to a nicotine habit she couldn't shake. She did eventually quit, just a few years before she died. But when you've been smoking heavily for over 7 decades, stopping in your late 70s doesn't undo that kind of damage. The years of irritation had stripped the elasticity from her airways, leaving her with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD. It's not a quick event like a heart attack. It's a slow, grinding physical decline where the lungs lose their ability to fully empty, trapping stale air inside and turning every exhale into something that requires effort. Doctors often describe the advanced stages of COPD as feeling like you're drowning on dry land. Because her lungs couldn't move oxygen efficiently, her heart had to work harder and harder to compensate, and that relentless strain eventually triggered congestive heart failure. One of the most physically commanding actresses the Golden Age ever produced spent her final months struggling to do something the rest of us never even think about. She died at 82, a woman who projected total control in every role she ever played, undone by a process she set in motion as a child. Number 4. Patrick Swayze. Watch him in Dirty Dancing or Roadhouse, and it's immediately clear what his whole screen presence was built on: pure physical mastery. He wasn't just performing, he was a trained dancer and a genuine athlete with a level of control, grace, and raw stamina that very few people ever reach. And yet the same man who treated his body like a precision instrument in front of the camera was putting it through something brutal away from it. Swayze was a heavy smoker, frequently reported to be getting through around 60 cigarettes a day. At that volume, the harm doesn't stay confined to the lungs. The carcinogens saturate the bloodstream and force the body's deep filtration organs to process a relentless daily load of toxins. In 2008, that sustained internal strain produced a diagnosis of stage 4 pancreatic cancer, one of the most aggressive and unforgiving diseases a person can face. What made Swayze's decline so haunting was the sheer, unrelenting grip that addiction had on him. He faced his illness the same way he faced everything else in his life, with raw stubbornness and a refusal to quit. He pushed through brutal rounds of chemotherapy and kept shooting an action television series while actively undergoing treatment. But the nicotine had carved itself so deep into his brain that even while battling a terminal smoking-related cancer, he openly admitted he couldn't fully stop. The survival instinct and the chemical dependency were pulling in opposite directions. His willpower was extraordinary, but the internal damage had already gone too far to undo. He died at 57 years old. A man whose body the world had celebrated at its absolute peak was ultimately beaten by an addiction that simply wouldn't release him. It's one of the more sobering stories this list has to offer. Number 3. John Wayne. At 6'4", John Wayne spent 50 years projecting the image of indestructible American toughness. He was the Duke, the kind of figure who seemed too massive, too hard-edged, to be brought down by anything ordinary. On screen, he walked through shootouts, stampedes, and wars without flinching. But away from the cameras, he was feeding his body a truly staggering amount of tobacco. People who knew him well reported he could go through 5 or 6 packs a day, which works out to somewhere between 100 and 120 cigarettes. At that volume, his lungs weren't occasionally exposed to smoke. They were operating inside it from the moment he woke up to the moment he closed his eyes at night. The human body doesn't care about cinematic mythology. In 1964, the damage caught up with him in the form of a severe lung cancer diagnosis. The surgical response was extreme. Doctors opened his chest and removed his entire left lung, along with several ribs, just to stop the cancer from spreading further. He survived that operation and pushed himself back to work, but decades of extreme smoking rarely stops at one organ. His body stayed compromised. Stomach cancer followed, and he passed away in 1979 at 72 years old. Audiences had spent decades watching him outgun every villain a screenplay could produce. Off-screen, the most celebrated symbol of American toughness was being quietly dismantled, piece by piece, by the habit he carried in his shirt pocket every single day. Number 2. Jackie Gleason. On television, Jackie Gleason was pure combustible energy. As Ralph Cramden on The Honeymooners, he owned every scene he was in: loud outbursts, wild physical comedy, a booming voice that swallowed up the room around him. He was a comedic force in the truest sense of the word. The physical machinery behind that enormous, raucous persona was running on a level of daily chemical consumption that's almost hard to believe. Gleason's habits were legendary in the industry, and not in a flattering way. Biographical accounts consistently put his cigarette intake at somewhere around 6 packs every single day. Do the math on that and you land at roughly 120 cigarettes. That's not a heavy habit. That's a continuous chemical drip. He was essentially lighting each new cigarette off the dying end of the last one, keeping a constant stream of toxins moving through his body from the moment he opened his eyes in the morning to the moment he closed them at night. Stack that extreme nicotine volume on top of his well-documented appetite for food and alcohol, and you've got a near-perfect recipe for cardiovascular collapse. Nicotine is a powerful vasoconstrictor, meaning it squeezes the arteries tighter while the heart works harder. A man of Gleason's size already needed his heart pumping at full capacity just to handle basic circulation. The daily smoke was actively working against that effort. His cardiovascular system was under constant siege. The body can only absorb that kind of relentless punishment for so long before something gives. Gleason's health declined into severe heart disease, eventually landing him on the table for a triple bypass surgery that his weakened body barely survived. He died at 71. The man who built his entire career on being loud, indestructible, and completely in control was quietly undone by a system failure he'd spent decades building himself. Coming in at number 1 is Yul Brynner. Few actors in Hollywood history carried a physical presence quite like his. The shaved head, the locked posture, the cold and penetrating stare. He didn't enter a room so much as take ownership of it. From the ruthless gunslinger in The Magnificent Seven to the iron-willed monarch in The King and I, he projected a kind of authority that felt genuinely untouchable. Off-camera, though, that commanding figure was completely in the grip of a heavy, multi-pack-a-day smoking habit. The deep, resonant voice that filled theater stages with imperial weight was being steadily coated in tar and chemical irritants. When doctors diagnosed him with inoperable lung cancer in the mid-1980s, the disease began systematically stripping away everything that had made him seem invincible. What puts Brynner at the top of this list isn't just the biology of his decline, it's what he chose to do about it. Most Hollywood stars, when their health starts unraveling, work hard to keep it hidden. The image matters more than the truth. Brynner went in the exact opposite direction. Knowing his lungs were failing and that his time was running short, he sat down in front of a camera and recorded one of the most blunt public service announcements the entertainment world had ever seen. He left strict instructions. The footage could only air after his death. In 1985, just weeks after he died at 65, the network broadcast it. Audiences watched a visibly gaunt Hollywood icon stare straight into the camera, delivering one final message from beyond. Now that I'm gone, I tell you, don't smoke. No movie magic, no glamour, just a legend deliberately tearing down his own myth to warn the world about the habit that had killed him. It was the most honest performance of his entire career, and arguably the most powerful. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below about which part of his life surprised you most. There are so many more stories like this one waiting for you right here on the channel, so see you in the next one.